I'd like to speak about three short presentations that I'm going to make for you that map out something about being a teacher and being a teacher in a public school and the organisational structures within which, using Ontario as an example, you'll find yourself working. I'm going to predicate this by reminding you again of the issues about being a professional and the ambiguities which are associated with that term. It's important for two reasons, because there are going to be times when you're going to have to justify your actions in terms of your professional behaviour. And the organisational structures are also important in this respect, insofar as, well, they're put in place fundamentally to support you being a professional in a profession. There are times in which the attempts to establish the rules of the game can create issues of tension as to whether you think that they force you to act professionally or not. So it's a useful exercise, I think, for us just to run through these. So I'll start off just by refreshing the nature of professional work. I'll then talk about the Ontario situation, in which there's an Ontario College of Teachers which has been established to control teaching in Ontario, and also has control over the means of entry into the occupation. So certainly for those of you who are aspiring to teach in Ontario, this is a very important organisation for you. I'll also talk about teaching as an occupation and as a paid occupation, in which you are employed by, in this case, a board to work as a teacher. So that's a different aspect again to being a professional. Then there's a third aspect I want to talk about, and organisationally, this has to do with the teachers' federations, or what are commonly referred to as the teachers' unions, and how they have an impact on your work as a teacher. So let's start off with the issue of what is a profession. Now, what is or can be called a profession? Is teaching a profession in Ontario? And within this context, what is the role of the Ministry of Education, the College of Teachers, and the Ontario Federation of Teachers? So let's start off then with the nature of professional work. Now, there are ambiguities in the use of the terms profession and professional and professionalism, and I'm just going to spend a minute to have you think about those. I've relied on the Oxford English Dictionary in all its huge glory to extract the definitions here, and I happen to have had access to the 1971 edition, but you'll find that these definitions have not changed greatly over the years. Now, just look at professionalism for a start. It's a professional quality, the character, method, or conduct, the stamp of a particular profession, as opposed to the position or practice of a professional as distinguished from an amateur, the class of professionals. In one case, it's referring to a particular set of occupations. To the other, it's the fact as to whether or not someone gets paid to do something or not. So let's just step backwards into the notion of being a professional, or professional as an adjective. One who belongs to the learned professions, a professional man. This is 1971. I'm sure they've modified this definition to be less gender-oriented now. Alternatively, it's one who makes a professional business of any occupation, art or sport, otherwise usually or often engaged in by amateurs, especially as a pastime. Now, the difference between these two definitions is really quite striking, particularly if we think in terms of social standing. The professions on the whole are occupations that hold a relatively high, even though people are often critical of them, high status within our society. On the other hand, traditionally, people who earn money for what others do by way of recreation, or are employed simply because of their capacity to do something that others might do for recreation, has been considered historically to be more of a lower class sort of situation in many ways. For example, if I can think with my background from Australia, thinking about cricket and the matches played between Australia and England, up to around about 40 years ago, the members of the England team who were professionals could not enter the gate to the ground through the same gateway as the gentlemen amateurs. So there's a real distinction between those two notions of being professional, and that does have implications. I just noticed a spelling error there, by the way. I left the R out of professional, and it's in the next one too. So it follows then that the Oxford Dictionary then goes on with considerable more detail about that, and you might like to just go back and read through these slides and pay a bit more attention to that. So this then begins us to the notion of a profession. It's an occupation in which a professed knowledge in some department of learning or science is used in its application to the affairs of others or in the practice of an art founded upon it. Historically, these original three were the divinity, law and medicine, and to some extent the military profession. This has been broadened considerably over the last several years. It is also used in a much more general sense to refer to many occupations in which someone earns their living. Now, I think it's worthwhile just thinking for a moment about the tradition of a profession in the European and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon background to it. The word profession, to make profession, particularly significant within notions of dealing within the church and its orders. Now, I would argue that the modern professions are structured very much along the lines of how the church and its religious orders were structured, starting off around about the Middle Ages. If we think about the religious orders, they're established by virtue of a decision by the church to allow a group of people within the church to undertake certain actions, be they the hospitallers or missionary groups or whatever, to go forth and do the work of the church within the guidelines and structures that the church might lay down. Now, if we think about that, they were seen to have a body of knowledge that they were going to use in the service of members of the faith. Their members were given a degree of autonomy within their organisation to use their judgment in the application of the knowledge they had within the constraints that were laid down by the rules of the order. Clearly, people who entered the orders had a sense of calling. The organisation itself was designated by the church to have a degree of self-regulation. There were rituals to include members, bring members in, to expel members, to govern the practice of their members, and also there were processes in place for imposing discipline when people stepped outside the bounds of proper practice within them. Now, I would suggest that they're very much the same sort of structures that operate with the churches within the professions now, with the exception we have a secularised version of it in which the professions have the same relation to the state as the religious orders had to the church. They only exist in their organised form because the state, in the case of Ontario, the province of Ontario's government, has seen fit to enact laws that enable teaching to be seen as a profession and to be policed through the College of Teachers that was established. So where do we get our recognition as teachers? Clearly there's social status attached. There's a claim to a particular body of knowledge. Now, I want you to think about what is the body of knowledge that teachers in particular have that they then use in their service to the general population. There's government recognition, and there are the formal internal structures, as I mentioned, through the College of Teachers, and I'm going to elaborate that in a later presentation. So the question is teaching a profession in Ontario? Well, it's governed by the Education Act, which is administered through the Ministry of Education. There's the Ontario College of Teachers Act, which lays down the organisational structure whereby it's claimed that teaching is a profession. There's the Ontario Federation of Teachers, which originally, back in 1946, was given many of the governing functions, but these were removed when the College of Teachers was established. But nevertheless, the Federation of Teachers has maintained its role, particularly on those sides of work, such as negotiating conditions of work and salaries and so forth, dealing with employers, in particular with the employers as represented through the boards of education in Ontario. And finally, there's another element that comes into it in the case of Ontario, which is the Education Quality and Accountability Office, which oversees the provincial testing, and we need at some point to consider how that relates to your work as a professional in Ontario. So, we have two metaphors that I like to think of when we're thinking about teaching as a profession. The first one is being a member of a profession, exercising situated judgment, making wise decisions for the benefit of the students with whom you're dealing, and with the notion of working for the good. The other is that as a paid employee, you have something of the role of a factory foreman or a bureaucrat, in which it's your responsibility to be making sure that the policies, that the work that's defined is efficiently carried out by you and by implication by your students as well. So in Ontario, it seems to me that there are a couple of conflicting moves in this respect. On the one hand, to establish and recognise teaching as a profession, the very important establishment of the College of Teachers, which had those functions, as I said, given to it, such as entry to the profession, discipline of its members, control over many aspects of the professional behaviour of teachers. But at the same time, we've seen increased curricular control, so that while that's been going on the one side, there has been a tightening of the areas in which teachers are able to practice and exercise their professional judgment, so that whereas, say, even in Ontario 30 years ago, there were very little by way of centrally mandated contents for the curriculum. Certainly in the elementary schools, there are now very detailed documents that lay down the content to be taught on each year, and that has been added to by the introduction of provincial testing at grades 3, 6 and 9 to make sure that the curriculum, particularly in mathematics and language, is being effectively taught. Now, as I've just alluded, the situation as it is now is highly dependent on the time, now, and the place, Ontario. Within any one jurisdiction, these conditions can change hugely over time. If we go back in Ontario to the 1960s and the very influential Hall-Dennis report that was presented to the government of the day, following that report, much of the control over curriculum was ceded to the local level, to the boards and to the schools, and it was hoped that there'd be huge diversity throughout the province in what was taught and how it was being taught, as a result of teachers making decisions about what they considered to be most appropriate individually, and even more importantly, as school staffs as a whole. That situation transpired in Ontario and ran through until the early 90s, when, following a report by George Radwanski in 1989, there was a reversal of much of that policy, leading to very detailed curricula which have been developed over the years, and the introduction of provincial testing. That's within the one jurisdiction, and it's within the lifetime of most teachers that they're likely to see that sort of change. At the same time, even now, if you were to go to another jurisdiction, for example in Finland, where the situation is very much like it was here 40 years ago. So time and place is very important in terms of the nature of the work that you're supposed to be doing now. So, why is it important? To think about, is teaching a profession, and are you able to act professionally? The answers you give to the question denote what accountability means for you, and hence what you can do. It suggests what issues should move teachers to action in the public forum, and it's a status issue along with all that involves. The next discussion that I'll go on with will be to talk about the Ontario College of Teachers and your entry into the profession of teaching.